Hi class, it's Miss Miller, and today what I'd like to do is continue our discussion on persuasive appeals. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the appeal to pathos, and this is where you engage the reader or your audience members in a completely different way. Now, in the past, we've discussed this idea of appealing to someone's sense of logic or tapping into their brain, or appealing to someone's sense of ethos and establishing trust. And today we're going to follow our heart and how do we feel. So we're going to focus on the basis or premise for appeal to pathos. Now, there's different ways in which you can appeal to the audience members, and we're all familiar with this idea of appeal to emotions. How do we feel when we're reading something? How do we want our audience members to feel? And so we might be listening to a speech or reading a written piece and might say, oh my goodness, I was so moved. I felt so sad by what I heard or what I saw or what I read. And you may say or think that it came from nowhere, but it's really important to know that in most cases, speakers are very deliberate about communicating in a way that sort of solicits some sort of emotion in their reader or audience members. Two other ways in which is not nearly as discussed as much when it comes to pathos would be appealing to someone's level or sense of interest. What do they get excited about in terms of your audience? And then how can you tap into a person's emotion or, imagination? Now, the purpose of pathos, one, is to get your reader's attention or your audience member's attention. You could start off with ethos, and you could also continue a speech or a reading or a written document with logos, and then you want to hook your reader and get them to be connected to what you're saying by using pathos. But it's also important to sustain the interest of your reader when you're using pathos. So you might be reading a speech, or you might be reading an essay or a short story, and maybe the author or the speaker presents a sense of logos where they give you some logical details or data or statistics. And perhaps they've even established credibility in some way, and they use a little bit of pathos through different ways, and we'll talk about ways in which you can appeal to someone's sense of pathos. And then you might see throughout the speech, you will hear different examples of pathos throughout the speech, sort of sprinkled in as a little subtle, and you wonder why it is that that person was able to maintain your interest for the entire speech, because perhaps they used this appeal to pathos throughout their speech. Also, it's important, another purpose would be for the speaker to sort of be able to get you to care about their topic, whatever that is, as much as they do. And also the speaker's ability to sort of tweak your emotions. Now, the last one is connecting the argument with the values or beliefs of the speaker, and we can discuss that in more detail in a different portion of the presentation. What I find interesting when talking about persuasive appeals is how they all really work together, the intersection of appeals. The appeals work together and often overlap. So it's very rare that you will see at least an effective persuasive work where they use one or two. Oftentimes the most effective would be where they all sort of work together, and in some cases simultaneously. You might see a sentence where it sort of embodies the appeal to ethos, logos, and pathos, and that's very possible. So you don't always have to pick one. So you might read something where they present you with a very startling statistic, but somewhere in that sentence, the author or speaker is able to embed appeal to pathos, and perhaps even at the beginning, they're establishing credibility. So all of these things are happening at one time, and that happens quite frequently in works. It's also important to note the effectiveness of pathos, that it should never be used in isolation. It's considered weak when it is done so. So for example, if you're presenting a speech, if all you do is get the person to feel a certain way and you use this beautiful language, but you don't present any other appeals like information or data or statistics, appeal to logos, or you haven't established trust, then oftentimes that persuasive pitch might not be very strong. The emphasis for pathos would be soliciting passions of the audience, to show sufferings, and also deep feelings. So those are interesting emphasis as it pertains to pathos. The connection or the audience's heart, there's different ways to do that. You can use personal connections when you are trying to appeal to pathos. You can tell stories or an anecdote, or you can provide a testimony, an example, a real life testimony of something that might help sort of solicit the emotion that you're wanting. And that's different ways that you can do that for pathos. Now, when I talk about pathos, I also like to talk about how the Victorian era sort of utilized pathos in their work, and also how modern day pathos is used, or how the readers might respond to pathos. So there was a time during the Victorian period where pathos, like let's say for example in a short story, was sort of exploited. The authors or speakers would really dwell on the details of like death, and they would do that or suffering for an extended portion of the speech, or even the short story or the novel or the essay. They would spend so much time discussing it, and that would be the way in which they communicate the pathos for that piece of work. But today, readers would prefer that writers use understatements or suggestions, that they are subtle as opposed to just spelling everything out for us as a reader. Now I'm going to remove myself from this screen so that you can see the whole slide. I'm hoping that you can see it. But this is a pathos behind the figurative language. So if you're reading something or you're listening to a speech and you're not sure what it is, if the speaker uses figurative language, or if you as a speaker would like to convey pathos, then you want to use different examples of figurative language. And so one example, and one that is most frequently used and often used, would be colorful language, imagery, very descriptive language throughout the work that sustains the reader, right, and sort of garners their attention and perhaps even gets us to feel a certain way. A lot of things are happening with pathos. You can use an oxymoron. I've seen speeches where they may have used an oxymoron 1 or 2 times in their speech, and it could be a lengthy speech, and it gets you thinking. Irony is another great example of figurative language that you can include or implement in a speech. You want to be deliberate about it if you are preparing a speech or an essay or a short story or a work, or you also want to be mindful of it if you're reading it and you're doing a close reading and you're looking for the pathos. This is an easy way to detect it if you see figurative language. Oftentimes you might not know which specific language it is. You just know that it's figurative language, and that's enough to say, hey, this is pathos. You'll also see the use of personification. You can use that once or two times. You could also use alliteration. That is super powerful in a work, and we've seen that in work that we've used. Metaphors, similes, hyperboles can be used frequently throughout a piece, or onomatopoeia. Okay, so there's 4 ways to identify with a reader. One is the writer's tone. Okay, so the writer can establish a tone with their audience through the language that they use. It can be informal. If they want it to be a very casual relationship, they want to say that we're buddies, so they might use casual language, very informal language. Or if the tone they want to use is formal, perhaps in that case they might be trying to establish, trying to get the reader to respect the speaker or admire the speaker. So the tone is really important in connecting with the reader. When I think of tone, I think of this commercial. Let's take a listen. It's only about 30 seconds in length. Commercial here.
Call you back. Is this my car? State Farm knows that for every one of those moments, this is ridiculous! There's one of these.
Is this my car? What? This is ridiculous.
This can't be happening!
This can't be happening.
Oh, it's happening, sweetheart. Oh, it's happening, sweetheart.
Shut up!
Shut up!
Ah!
That's why State Farm is there.
What a day.
With car insurance for when things go wrong. What a day! But also here with car loans to help life go right. State Farm.
That's what when I think of tone, I think of that. So it just depends on what you want to communicate to your audience. So that was one, which was the tone, right? Another way to connect is through the topic, the issue, the people, and the text. Explain the importance and emotion. So if you are trying to connect with your audience, you might just focus on what the issue is, like homelessness or housing or poverty or shelter, whatever that is. Another way to connect with the audience would be through a specific audience in mind. So perhaps you just would be focused on environmentalists or feminists or Republicans. You might look out into the audience and just see one group of people as opposed to a huge group for your audience. Now, number 4 would actually be specific interest. And that's another way to connect with your audience. You can take their interests and sort of connect it with their beliefs or values. For example, let's take like the hat policy. Some schools sort of maintain a policy where you're not allowed to wear hats. And so you know that this is an interest. Let's say that the student is arguing this idea. And so you go under the belief, you know that his belief is that, gosh, if I don't wear this hat, then, people are going to laugh at me. My hair looks silly or it looks sloppy. I wear the hat, because I want to look nice and I don't want to be laughed at. The belief is that if I take this off, I'm not going to look as nice as if I kept it on. And so obviously they value their image. And so lastly, these are some discussion questions that are framed around this idea of appeal to pathos. How do the opening sentences hook the reader? What kind of relationship does the speaker try to establish with the audience? How does the speaker get you to care about their topic? And so these are things that you think about as you are dissecting a piece and you're looking for the pathos and ways in which it impacts the overall work. What are the shared interests and values, and do you consider yourself as the intended audience? That's always interesting. So I hope that you found this helpful. We've covered appeal to ethos, appeal to logos, and then today finally we have the appeal to pathos.